This is San Francisco.
Gavin Newsom was just an up-and-coming mayor when he appointed himself top ally to the gays by briefly legalizing marriage in San Francisco, marriages that were later declared null and void by the court. But along the way, he posed for photos at fundraiser galas at the SF LGBT Center as he climbed the political ladder to governor. Why should we be suspicious of politicians who build their political empires by pandering to the massive gay campaign fundraising mechanisms like Equality California and generally the idea of voting with gay? So on today's episode, I am utterly stoked to welcome someone who is, in my mind, the only person deserving of the title of cultural critic, and that person is Yasmin Nair. Yasmin is a writer, academic, and activist based in Hyde Park, Chicago. Her work is all archived at yasminnair.com, YasminNair.com. Welcome to San Francisco, Yasmin.
Such a pleasure, Toshu. I love that we're finally doing this. Love you, love everyone in Gay Shame and everything going on in your area. It's always very, very inspiring. Massively, sort of a hot locus for all of us. So thank you.
Yeah.
It's a great pleasure to come on and talk about gay allies and gay politics.
Gotta love them. Can't really live without them. They're everywhere these days, especially in these loci of progressivism and neoliberalism, liberalism, whatever you want to call it. And I'm speaking to you, of course, from San Francisco. You're in Chicago, and there's a lot of parallels. And when we met, Yasmin was doing work with Brian Conrad on their project Against Equality, which it kind of collects through 3 anthologies and an accompanying website, radical responses to the LGBT inclusion politics of the 1990s and the early 2000s, when the wealthiest, mostly white, gay, and lesbian elite were promoting their pet projects of getting gays in the military, getting gays married with marriage licenses, and prisons and hate crime legislation, all of society's, worst institutions. And the gay elite were the only voices allowed in the mass media. So you had a situation where we were seen as a monolithic movement. Everyone who was gay thought one way. We all wanted a stronger military and more prisons. In this conversation about allyship and queer politics being a little bit more nuanced, or a lot more nuanced than I think people still consider even in 2023. I'm going to mention some things that we're not going to have time to discuss tonight at length about Gavin Newsom, top ally to the gays. There was the time Gavin Newsom cheated on Kimberly Guilfoyle, who was the anchor at Fox News, who's now the future Mrs. Donald Trump Jr., his own campaign manager's wife. That was a big scandal here in San Francisco. It was on the front page of every newspaper here. Newsom's Plump Jack wine empire took over San Francisco's sole remaining lesbian bar, the Lexington, and turned it into another California cuisine restaurant featuring Newsom's wines and wines from his vineyard that he owns with one of the Gettys. Also, won't be mentioning Newsom's top gubernatorial campaign fundraiser, the disgraced and debarred lawyer, Tom Girardi, who is also the ex of Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. Well, she was a gay icon, I suppose. Erica Jane. I think you can check out a funny documentary on Hulu about those two and the swindling of the victims of the PG&E fires nearby in San Bruno. There's also the time that the San Francisco LGBT Center, ghostly, kind of always empty building on Market Street that recently underwent a $5 million renovation, in the midst of this houselessness crisis. We needed to redo this center that gets zero use. They held a fundraiser for Newsom's mayoral campaign back in the day, and that fundraiser was protested by the queer direct action group Gay Shame. LGBT center administrators called in the police, and a bunch of the protesters were left bloody. They were protesting Newsom's proposal to supposedly give care and not cash to cut people's Social Security payments locally.
I remember that. Yeah. I remember his anti-homelessness, what he called anti-homelessness strategy, I remember, was basically get them out, right? Or get them off the streets. And I think, as I recall, did they remove benches or install spikes everywhere?
Both.
Both. Oh, how lovely, how charming,
yeah.
how amazing.
Lots of defensive architecture everywhere you look.
Defensive architecture, right. That's a scary but also extraordinarily. That's just an excellent term for how cities are being built these days, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's wild that pretty much any space under an awning or a place where you might get some reprieve from the rain, you're going to find some kind of a block to people who might otherwise be able to sleep there, even as we have 4,000 too few shelter beds for people to stay in. And shelters are not a home, but even that very basic level of like humanity is missing.
All under the politics of a man who was ardently a gay ally. And that's so fascinating to me. And that's something I know we want to talk about.
Yeah, because I mean, in San Francisco, it's certainly true. And it's true, I know, more generally, the statistic that 40% of the homeless population in San Francisco is queer, self-identified, queer, trans, self-identified youth. This is thousands of people we're talking about, just according to the city's own statistics, who are queer homeless youth. And it's kind of strange when you look at that against this idea that San Francisco allegedly has, most pro-gay, ex-mayor Gavin Newsom out there.
Well, we beat you. We got not only a lesbian mayor, we got a Black lesbian mayor, and with just as disastrous consequences. What you're saying about the number of LGBTQ people who are also homeless, you said 40%. That resonates with me here because Chicago not only has a gay Black mayor, but is also a very gay city in many ways. Like, it's completely controlled. I imagine it's the same thing in San Francisco. It is controlled by mostly gay white men, or people who take on, gay white men-ness. You can be Black and take on gay white men-ness, as Lori Lightfoot does. And in Chicago, for instance, we've had similar issues where you may have heard about the Center on Halsted, which is ostensibly there to provide health services and other social service counseling services and so on, and how badly it has treated especially lower income youth of color. And how the neighborhood around the Center on Halsted, which has predominantly been a gay neighborhood, has always consistently, even to this day, consistently opposes queer Black and brown youth coming into the neighborhood to access those services. At one point, and I think this is still true, the Center on Halsted actually has, and yes, this resonates with all of us historically, the Center on Halsted has a separate back entrance for the youth. And,
damn.
Chicago is unashamedly a plantation city. Right. And the fact that it is now run by a Black lesbian is actually in some ways is no accident, really. It's all in keeping with this terrible past and present. I'm just fascinated by the idea of how, we were talking about this before, which is how does gayness and gay identity enable these kinds of policings of not only cities, I think, not non-urban areas as well, but it seems like there's a way in which gay identity over the last 30 odd years has come to enable the most virulent forms of neoliberalism, which is to say the extraordinary privatization, which is how I define neoliberalism, is just the extraordinary privatization of resources that should be freely available to everyone. I'm originally from India, as you may know, and right now there is this massive explosion, this controversy around this I think he's the second richest man in the world named Adani, who essentially owns all of India's water, all resources go through his family. And there's this whole, it's actually delightful to watch. His entire empire, we hope, is now crumbling because there's this massive this scandal around financial shenanigans and so on. It's too complicated to go into. But the point being that that's what neoliberalism does, overtake everyone's private resources. And gayness, I think, it's really fascinating to have you bring up Gavin Newsom's history with gay marriage. I can remember, and you were referring to this, I remember when he and Guilfoyle were the glamour couple of the era. And that photograph, right, in Vogue, I think, or Vanity Fair.
Harper's Bazaar.
Yeah. So I'm sort of really interested because Chicago and San Francisco have similar histories with gay identity, but also very different. I mean, we've had, for instance, two Richard Dalleys, one J and one M, as mayors. The older Daley was notoriously homophobic. He instituted a lot of clothing laws, for instance. There were constant raids on bars, very, very violent raids on bars by police and so on. The younger Daley began in some similar way to his father, but then realized that the gay community was powerful and increasingly becoming very wealthy. So he he was actually very gay friendly. And by gay friendly, of course, we mean friendly to the power gays, right? But there were some advantages. So, for instance, in during the AIDS crisis, Chicago, I think, was the only major city, unlike San Francisco and New York and LA. Chicago was the only city that did not shut down its bathhouses.
Right.
Because they knew that this was not this was not how AIDS was getting around.
People in bathhouses tend to be the most safe in terms of access to condoms and that sort of thing.
Right. And it's because Daley had that very direct connection with a certain part of the gay community that was actually, fairly good around and was pushing back against all the AIDS hysteria. It's because of that we did not see that particular kind of policy. So that's just to bring in a sort of a complication into, how gay identity works. But
Right. Yeah. And then when one of the last Boys Town bathhouses was turned into condos, and I can't remember the name. It was the name of the guy.
Steamworks? Was it Steamworks? No.
It wasn't Steamworks.
No,
Steamworks
is still around.
Okay, I'm not going to fight it at the moment. The bathhouse was shut down, and the condos that went up were named after the founder as some little ode. All of the people who might have frequented the bathhouse were certainly gentrified out. Kind of similarly here, one of the local supervisors was hailed as sort of a hero when he proposed to undo the legislation that during the 80s had closed the bathhouses here. He did this, and it was just as one of the privatized cruising spots, the only gay strip club in the city, had just closed. And so it was done under the guise of here, I'm doing something that's so progressive, undoing this law that was anti-gay. And it's not as though there are all of these businesses that can afford to come in and pay the rents and deal with all of the neighborhood groups that are going to be against all of the sort of pre-production that you have to do before opening that sort of business. So we don't have that passed early on in the COVID pandemic, and we don't have any new bathhouses that are set to open here for being allegedly this gay capital.
That's interesting, because I think bathhouses are also very much classified according to class, at least in Chicago. Maybe we just have a range of bathhouses for the well-offs and then the not so well-offs. Man's Country was always hated by the gays who lived in the area that I lived in because it was seen as not as quote unquote classy enough, as opposed to, I think maybe it's Steamworks that's seen as the bougie bathhouse. They always hated Chuck Renslow. They were always trying to shut it down.
It is Renslow. Yeah, it's Renslow that I was thinking of.
It's Renslow Apartments. They named.
Yes.
I loved that guy. If you go back into gay history, if anyone wants to do this, if you go back into gay history documents, you will find his name coming up in the 30s and the 40s. And it's like he just lived forever. Dude was just around. I mean, he's a vital figure. But mainstream gays in Chicago hated him, hated what he represented. And I think there's that kind of interesting tension in the gay community as well. I will give you one amusing anecdote, which is that when I lived in Andersonville, and this was right down the street, right down the block from Man's Country, there was this and I've always called it a jerk stop, basically. It was like a video store which only they wouldn't let me in as a woman, by the way.
Okay.
They ran to the door and they're like, oh, no. Anyway, so you basically, there used to be a thing, I don't know if it's a thing anymore, where you went to watch gay porn on jerk off. Fine. That business was owned by a guy who lived in the same building, right? And I think he also owned the building. And then one day, this building opposite this gay porn store, it's called Banana Video. There was a building opposite that, which became a mattress store. And, this gay guy whom I knew enough to talk to as a neighbor and so on, was just raging about the mattress store. It's like, we can't have that kind of a business here. That's because, as you know, mattress stores are associated with lower income, because everyone needs a good mattress. But he was furious about this mattress store bringing down the neighborhood. And I wanted to look at him and go, dude, you own a jerk video store. I think it's fine. I think an ideal neighborhood has a mattress store and a jerk. I think that brings up the question around class and gay identity, right? And the ways in which the gay mainstream is always in tension about what it considers to be a class identity, how it ascends into power is fascinating.
Yeah. And recently, we had an election here, and we have a board of supervisors who are just below the mayor, and they, allegedly represent, the different neighborhoods here. And 3 of them are gay. And
of course.
Yeah, I mean,
of course they're gay.
They're the most conservative of all of the supervisors. We have Raphael Mandelman in the Castro, who's really continuing his predecessor, Scott Wiener, his kind of reign of terror against houseless people. He was the one who, so this judge, this is another tangent, but a judge in Oakland in the California Supreme Court deemed San Francisco specifically was just being super fucked up to homeless people, terrorizing them via police, via the private security forces that San Francisco contracts out with. The center on Halstead, and certainly at the LGBT center here, there's it's paid for in part by the city, and part of that money goes to pay these private security guards that are always outside.
Yeah, we've had that issue with Center on Halstead as well, and with other gay organizations, which are funded by the community, but then also hire private security guards to keep the community out. I live in Hyde Park, which is home to the University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago has, I believe, what is the second largest private security force in the country. Mm-hmm. And it has the regular Chicago Police Department. So we have 2 police departments patrolling. Of course, the nice condos are all the time, but we still have shootings. I mean, I have escaped. I'm sorry to say this, but I have escaped being shot 3 times.
And Hyde Park, I mean, last time I went to Hyde Park,
it's fancy.
Nice.
It's fancy. It has all this gorgeous architecture. Parts of it are it's a really isolated bubble on the south side, and it ferociously guards its resources. Mm-hmm. And the 2 police forces are exactly what, obviously, but it's all within a bubble in an area that is constantly being decimated by, again, the neoliberal policies of the city, of the state, of the country. Obama is bringing his presidential library, which is to say a gigantic building, into Hyde Park. He's bringing it into Jackson Park, which he should not have done. It's public property. But of course, the city gave him like, a 90-year lease for $10 or some ridiculous amount like that. But I guess, this is all so fascinating, isn't it? Because then we have to ask, if gay identity is such a motor of neoliberalism, then we do have to also ask, is there any point in pursuing queer/gay representation to bring about change, right? And when we think about abolition politics, for instance, it is the motor, right, of abolitionist politics right now in terms of prison abolition. The people who have most worked on it and really brought it to fruition are Black women. Many of them are Black queer women, but, Angela Davis and Mariam Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and so many others. The ways in which prison abolition has moved forward, Miss Major, so many, right? But the ways in which prison abolition has moved forward is because radical people who also happen to be women and queer and Black have constantly fought for it to be understood in terms that do not always compromise, right? The vision of abolition. Right. I will say, I wish we talked more about sex offender registries, but that's a whole other conversation to be had. Never mind, so it's not about a purity of politics. It is about not compromising on one's tenets. And so even now, although I think prison abolition is so fashionable among many, right? You have all these celebrities now talking about, and the jails. And I'm like, yeah, you don't really mean that. Shut up. But these women and these queer people have constantly stuck to the essential politics, right, of prison abolition. I don't see anything like that happening around queer politics right now. I see obviously groups like Gay Shame, and we've attempted this in Gender Just. I was once part of a group that then ended up being a pro-gay marriage group called Queer to the Left. But for a while, for a brief evanescent moment, right, Queer to the Left was about just, really resisting gentrification, for instance, being anti-war and so on. And I'm wondering, but that group then ended up becoming pro-gay marriage. Which means you're for the violence of the military, you're for the violence of the prison industrial complex, right, and so on. So, is there anything? I'm thinking about Gay Shame and Gender Just, for instance, and all of us queer radicals doing the work we do. And is that to do with any sense that we have still that there's a queer radical politics to be recovered that can further the dismantling of neoliberalism? Or is it that we're always going to be destroyed by these fuckers who take up Chuck Renslow's name and slap it on condos? Right. And I'm not saying he was a radical, but he was a really interesting guy, by the way. There's a book about him edited by Tracy. Okay. I recommend everyone. I'm interested. Just again, a tangent. He lived to like 120 or something, and he was extremely nearsighted, but he would insist on driving this gigantic old Cadillac down the street. And every now and then I would find it wrapped around a lamppost in my neighborhood. But he was amazing. Like he was just an astonishing figure. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent that can be edited out if necessary.
But now we have people that are just out as, neoliberals, that people do want to privatize the public. People like Pete Buttigieg, that gay guy that ran for president, Lori Lightfoot. It wasn't a secret that she was trying to build this cop, almost like a cop city, but for Chicago, as she was campaigning for mayor. And then, I mentioned that we have these 3 gay supervisors here in San Francisco who are all more conservative than the people that they ran against. They recently had this event here at a Zionist bar in the Mission called Manny's. It was called A Night with the Power Gays. And you just have these 3 white gay guys, one of whom was the literal communications director of the police prior to his being appointed as a supervisor by the mayor. And then one of the other ones, some of us call him Ralph, but he goes by Raphael Mandelman. And it's another indication of like, okay, well, he definitely took on this name in order to give the air of, being a little bit ethnic, like
right.
the whitest guy alive. I know that it works in places like San Francisco and Chicago, that just veneer of, I don't know, a whiff of something.
Yes, but then I wondered, I think a lot of this is because, and we saw this happening with the gay marriage problem, right? Which is that a lot of straight people, I think, even straight people who were, for instance, suspicious of marriage, and I think this is what gay politics does, is that it imbues everything with an inherently radical or /progressive/leftist facade.
Yeah.
When it's the opposite. So I know, for instance, a lot of straight people who themselves either were not married or who did not care for marriage, did not think that marriage should structure our very existence, as in terms of our health, in terms of healthcare and so on, were nervous, openly nervous or behind the scenes nervous about being against gay marriage because they thought, people would come up to me and say, yes, I only got married, for instance, because of healthcare. It's true. I think gay marriage made marriage, it completely shut out healthcare, right, out of the political discussion. It removed it from that landscape, and it made marriage somehow something ethereal and desirable and to be wanted by everyone, just as a lot of feminists, straight and queer, were happy to be done with it. So,
right.
And I think that there's also that problem with the left, and of course the right, does its own thing. But I think what is fascinating then is to see today, for instance, and we saw this in the UK first with David Cameron, the Conservative Prime Minister, coming out in favor of gay marriage. Right. And we're seeing this now as well in the United States, where now Republicans and right-wingers are not just not talking about gay marriage. We might recall that I think it was in 2016, no one, not even Trump, was talking about gay marriage. No one thought it was an issue even, whereas in 2008, it had been a bit of an issue, 2004, certainly. But that interest in using gay marriage as a quote-unquote wedge issue has declined to extinction, right? And you now have even Republicans are all happy about gay marriage because they recognize it as what it is, which is to say a conservative issue, not only culturally, but economically, right? And politically, because it stitches people into that neoliberal framework of privatized resources. And then I remember years ago, a friend of mine said, well, so what is useful about queer anymore? Is it necessarily inherently radical? And that, I think, is a question is there a queer left? I don't know, but a lot of us queers have not grappled with it. And in large part because we're so damn busy fighting for our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, not only did you have like the gay marriage industrial complex coming for people's minds and values, but of course there were the tons of resources that were put towards that particular fight that ended up not going to queer homeless youth, getting them a place to live and food that they could easily access, etc., just bare necessities.
Gay shame, I think, as I understand it, gay shame is really responsible, for instance, for demolishing the ridiculous discourse around YIMBYism. Gay shame was being pilloried by so many people. And I recall this because I'm a moderator on the Against Equality Facebook page. Not to think that, not to assume that online stuff is what matters, but we were constantly batting down people who would bring up these arguments against gay shame's activism and so on. And there was this real anger. The conversation has switched so amazingly because now everyone mocks YIMBYs, which is fantastic. So I think that kind of that sort of radical persistence is obviously so clear. Gay shame's been around for what, like 100 years now? That radical persistence, which is not connected to a formal nonprofit structure, has been so critical. But it's also not entirely sustainable for everyone everywhere. What do we do to shift the conversations and the politics around all of this? In Chicago, Lightfoot may still be defeated. I don't know. There is one candidate who's supported by Chicago Teachers Union, Johnson, who seems promising in terms of his ability to win. Not that he's not a good candidate, but Lightfoot has the gays behind her, gay white men behind her, and there's a lot of money to be poured in.
Yeah.
Is it necessarily connected to a radical politics? Then becomes the question. And what would it mean? I'm really struggling with this in terms of trying to think about what change can mean through a radical lens when language is what we seem to fight over more than anything else. And I don't think, for instance, I honestly do not think, and I firmly believe that online discourse is not even a tenth as important as people online want to think it is. But there is a way in which it can generate a kind of sub-discourse that then, moves things around in the quote-unquote real world, perhaps, right? So
sure.
The pandemic, I think, has pushed a lot of people's awareness of how things really happen politically and in the real, dare I say, the real world, on the street, right, within the corridors of power. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, yes, you can have 100,000, supposedly, they're all fake accounts, first of all, making a lot of fuss about something online. But the legislation against us continues. Right? Why is there so much anti-trans legislation, which is horrifying at this point? I mean, I wake up every morning and I think, they did what now? Why is that able to move through as successfully as it does? If we really think that our ire and our outrage and our constant, discussions around language actually matter, they don't matter, clearly, right? So, and I'm really concerned about the fact that at least certain segments of organizing communities tend to pay more attention to online crap than to organizing in real time.
For sure.
And there's also, I think, a lot of fear among a lot of people within organizing circles of not saying something that might seem intransigent or might get tweeted out, for instance. That's the other problem, right?
Like the self-policing,
The self-policing, the inability to have complicated conversations, for instance. All of those things are real problems. And in some ways, this is also why, although I depend on social media so much to get my work out, I would also be fine if Twitter just fucking disappeared tomorrow, because that thing is just a toxic web of shitty, toxic crap. I lose language when I talk about Twitter, because it is so appalling in its toxicity. We don't have to go back to the old days of phone trees, but there have to be better ways of communication and of organizing.
Yeah, I think leaving things up to the algorithm threatens our lives.
Right. Will this look bad, as opposed to, is this what we should be doing? Quote unquote, what are the optics of this seems to be the bigger question for many people, rather than what is it that is truly radical? What is the heart of our politics, and how do we continue with that? How do we persist with that politics?
So go to yasminnair.com for more. And thanks for spending time in San Francisco, which is a podcast produced by Toshio Moronik and Caitlin Wood. We release a new episode every week with bonus episodes for subscribers of the show. And if you like the show, go to patreon.com/SADFrancisco or subscribe on Apple Podcasts for more.